still face many challenges today, including violent conflict that is affecting women and girls around the world. To welcome you to this session, I would like to invite Valerie Guarneri, Assistant Executive Director at the World Food Programme. Welcome, Valerie.
Happy International Women's Day and welcome colleagues, member states, distinguished guests to today's commemoration of International Women's Day. And it is my honor to launch this important event on behalf of the United Nations Rome-based agencies. International Women's Day offers both an opportunity to reflect on the significant achievements we have made in women's empowerment and gender equality, but also to highlight that much more work is needed. And this year's theme is Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. And this recognizes the important roles that women play every day in supporting a more sustainable future. The UN Rome-based agencies are firmly committed to promoting gender equality and women's empowerment to advance sustainable and secure food systems worldwide. And we recognize the critical importance that climate action, adaptation, and resilience play in mitigating further challenges to food security and good nutrition. FAO, IFAD, and WFP have a rich experience of collaborating on climate adaptation projects, for example, those financed by the Green Climate Fund. And our partnerships support communities on the front lines of the climate crisis to anticipate climate hazards before they turn into disasters, restore degraded ecosystems, and protect the most vulnerable with safety nets and insurance. Our climate solutions empower women with access to early warning information and forecast-based financing before a disaster strikes. And they also provide training to women on climate resilience agricultural practices to prevent and mitigate adverse impacts. You'll be hearing more specific examples of these programs throughout the month of March in several other side events planned by the Rome-based agencies at the upcoming 66th Commission on the Status of Women. But progress towards gender equality and women's empowerment has been eroded and is being eroded due to conflict, COVID, and the climate crisis. Extreme temperatures, heat waves, droughts, storms, and floods damage the very systems that produce and process food and get it to people's tables. And last year, acute hunger was at record levels. And we know that now a staggering 45 million people are just one shock away from famine. Many of these same factors that threaten food security perpetuate gender inequalities. And women and girls are at greater risk of bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. 80% of people displaced due to climate-related disasters are women and girls. We are disadvantaged in society, more exposed to poverty and vulnerabilities, and social norms and structural barriers in many countries limit women's access to productive resources such as land, credit, and training, as well as to decision-making processes within communities. These barriers undermine the ability of women to adapt to the climate crisis and participate in dialogues and design solutions. And women play a critical role in building community resilience to adapt to climate change. Without our voices at the table, without all women's voices at the table, we risk further worsening gender inequalities and deepening the impact of the climate crisis. And this goes double for women within groups that are also not sufficiently included, such as youth, indigenous communities, people with disabilities, and refugee and displaced populations. A UNFCCC Secretariat report for COP26 found that women are not only underrepresented in climate change negotiations, they're also allocated less speaking time than their male counterparts in such dialogues, and we've experienced that, haven't we? Although some progress has been made in gender parity in climate leadership, at the current rate, parity will not be achieved until 2068. We need to speeden up that growth. Evidence has shown a direct correlation between female representation in national parliaments and stricter climate change policies, including lower carbon emissions. Women's leadership and meaningful participation in climate-related dialogues is of utmost importance when it comes to sustainability issues. And last year's International Women's Day discussed the need for an increase in women's leadership. And we will all recall that some of the best, most innovative, and most effective COVID-19 responses came from countries headed by women. WFP's updated gender policy was approved last week and sets an ambitious plan for women's empowerment and gender equality. And in this policy, we continue to underscore the importance of equal participation in leadership for women and for men. We all strive towards a world where women have increased power to take up leadership roles and make decisions about their personal, household, and community food needs. A sustainable future is only possible when women and girls have access, equal access, to the opportunities and resources that influence decision-making about the challenges that they face. And without accelerated progress in SDG 5, gender equality, zero hunger, SDG 2, and all the sustainable development goals will be out of reach. Thank you so much for joining us today on this very special theme for International Women's Day. And I am honored to pass the floor to Her Excellency Aisha Goldberg, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the Rome-based agencies, for today's keynote address. Thank you and happy International Women's Day.
Merci, merci infiniment Valérie et bon après-midi, bon matin, bonne soirée à tous et à toutes. Je suis franchement ravie de soyez parmi vous dans cette journée si importante et un sujet qui est crucial. De mon point de vue, les changements climatiques, l'insécurité alimentaire et l'inégalité des genres sont trois des défis les plus importants pour nous tous et profondément interreliés, comme Valérie vient de nous dire. Et ils sont les trois défis les plus importants pour l'humanité et à laquelle l'humanité est confrontée. Et même si nous sommes tous touchés par les changements climatiques, ce sont les plus pauvres et les plus vulnérables en ceux qui souffrent les plus, et ceux qui sont les femmes et les filles rurales et les femmes petites agricultures qui sont touchées de façon disproportionnée par les crises liées au climat. Indeed, we know what the data is telling us. The data is telling us that unequal access by rural women to resources, to knowledge, to capacities, and to climate finance to respond is holding us all back. While women make up more than 40% of the agricultural labor force, in least developed countries, fewer than 20% of landholders are women, and women receive only 7% of total investments in agriculture. Also, because of their double or in some instances triple burden, women often lack the time to participate in community decision-making, to gain knowledge on adaptation strategies, and to invest in new resilient livelihoods. Women typically perform 3 times as much unpaid work as men, providing water, food, nutrition for their loved ones, raising children and caring for the sick and the elderly, all the while trying to earn an income and work hard on family farms. That having been said, I am nevertheless optimistic. I'm optimistic for a few reasons. I'm optimistic because I know that addressing gender inequality can have profoundly positive impacts for creating sustainable food systems and dealing with the climate crisis. And I'm optimistic because I know that rural women are incredible agents of change. They are powerful innovators and leaders in their own right in shifting us to sustainable solutions, but only if we make sure that we can sustain the momentum that we've been building over the last couple of years towards increasing their abilities to do so. And so let's examine the counterfactual. What would happen if we could free up rural women's time and energy and give them the kind of training and resources we need to enable them to excel and to thrive? Well, according to our colleagues at FAO, If women had the same access to productive resources as men, their farm yields could increase by 20 to 30%, which could pull 150 million people out of hunger. The evidence tells us that investing in women is likely to improve soil conservation, to enable more trees to be planted, and women would also be better equipped to rebound after extreme weather events. So investing in climate-smart agriculture and local businesses led by women means that growth can work for everyone. We need to unlock the full potential of women and girls in all of their diversity. And I can tell you that Canada is committed to this effort, both at home and abroad. For the last 5 years, all of Canada's investments in development have been guided by its feminist international assistance policy. And the intersection between women's rights and climate adaptation has been a key focus for us. Gender equality plays a central role in our fight against climate change. And this is because we have recognized the value proposition inherent in enabling women to thrive in this particular space. We've doubled our climate finance investment to $5.3 billion over the next 5 years, and at least 80% of that financing is going to integrate a gender equality perspective. At COP26, we were proud to join the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Coalition to help advance gender equality in both domestic and international climate action. Canada's adopted a feminist lens, not only because we believe that gender equality is a fundamental right, but because we believe that promoting gender equality and supporting the empowerment of women and girls is the absolute most effective approach for us to be able collectively to reduce poverty and build more sustainable, inclusive, and just world. As Valerie said, the interconnections between SDGs 1, 2, 5, 13, 16 are undeniable. And we need to be working together in order to be able to enable the kind of progress that we set out for ourselves when we adopted the SDGs. And certainly in our programs, Canada seeks to address systemic and intersectional inequalities and try to get at the structural barriers and harmful social norms that can limit women's success in agriculture and food production. This includes, for instance, supporting local women-led agricultural businesses and actions that improve equal access to capital, markets, digital technology, and business development services. We need to be looking at the value chain of supports that can help women to succeed. So for example, in Colombia, we're working to make credit more easily available to rural women and youth so that they can invest in increasing their production and enhancing their businesses. We work with both the financial system, with the commercial banking system, and with the women themselves so that both the products that are offered to women are accessible and appropriate for their needs, but also so that women can identify for themselves bankable ideas. It's hoped that all of this will create long-term sustainable supply of rural credit that enable rural women to have the means to invest in growing their own businesses. And a cornerstone of this approach is also to prioritize women's voices and women's leadership as accelerators of change, and in particular at the local level. A good example of this is the work that we've been doing through the Equality Fund. This unique Canadian initiative is an innovative platform that brings together government, philanthropic, private sector, and civil society partners to be able to mobilize sustainable funding directly for grassroots women's rights organizations and movements in developing economies. Increasing women's participation in decision-making, as Valerie noted, and fostering more equitable access to and control over resources means that we need to deploy gender lens investing, including in all of our climate finance. It's important that we as governments and member states show how leadership can be advanced in enabling gender equality and making sure that it is considered in all of our global financing initiatives and decisions. For example, in the Green Climate Fund, Canada's played a leading role in updating the gender policy for 2022 to 2023. Among the central challenges is requiring that systemic gender mainstreaming is done through GCF policies, plans, and programs, and making sure that gender assessments are a requirement at the project level, and also making sure that we do this through the life cycle of the project including through to evaluation and applying feminist methodologies to the evaluation process so that we get women's voices throughout the project cycle. So in conclusion, let me just underscore that the Rome-based agencies are really critical partners in our shared goal of meaningfully addressing the triple challenges of food insecurity, climate change, and gender inequality. On this International Women's Day, as we recognize that we can't build climate resilient food systems without women's leadership and empowerment, let's also renew our commitment to gender equality more generally so that we can enjoy a sustainable tomorrow. I'm really delighted that this panel is looking at intersectionality and inclusion of persons with all abilities. Inclusiveness and intersectional approaches are the key to making sure that we can succeed collectively on gender equality and have certainly been a cornerstone of Canada's efforts. It's time for all women and girls in all of their diversity to be recognized as drivers for sustainable climate solutions. And I know that we can work together collectively to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for those remarks, and for Canada, really, for being at the forefront of promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. And I really do like the way you have presented to us this counterfactual of what we can actually do today, the actions that we need to take today if we want to see a more equal world tomorrow. I would now like to invite Jyotsna Puri, the Associate Vice President of IFAD, to give some welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, Jemima. Ambassador Goldberg, Valerie, Maria Elena, Excellencies, Member State representatives, distinguished guests, panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a privilege for me to be here today. Here's wishing you all a strong and equal Women's Day today and year. Before I start, my support especially goes out, and I know I speak on behalf of everyone here, to all of the women and children that have been forcibly displaced and forced out of their homes in Ukraine, but also the men that are being left behind. Conflict and climate have especially critical effects on us today, but also in the long run. Ladies and gentlemen, while keeping them in our hearts and minds, I want to share with you the story of Aisha in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, regular flooding, rising sea levels are continuously changing the coastline for many homes. Aisha's home many years ago lost everything when the river washed away the land. They resettled on a newly formed char. So these are river islands formed from sedimentation. And money was illegally extorted from them to occupy this plot of land. But the salinity of water was so high that they could not drink it. There were no wells, no ponds. Life was very challenging. There was also another difficulty. They faced an uncertain future. They were trying to rebuild their lives on lands that they did not own. But yet then 8 years ago, when she and her family joined an ambitious and wide-ranging project supported by IFAD, amongst others, the project helped them gain rights to the land and the skills and the finances to develop it. With training in fisheries, crop cultivation, cattle rearing, as well as access to microfinance loan, Aisha's family was able to start investing in farming and livestock. Nonetheless, these investments were still at risk. While the reclaimed land remained vulnerable to floods and erosion, so that a lot of the major investments that they were making to protect them from disasters, such as building raised roads, drainage canals, and forest plantations, were still very much exposed to risk. The land itself was not being secured physically or legally. So surveys were carried out to chart each plot of land. Legal hearings were held to reassign land rights to dwellers, and land titles began to be registered in the names of husbands and wives with equal ownership shares. On land right titles, the wife was named first on the title, which means that if she is widowed, divorced, or abandoned, the land belongs entirely to her. Land titles today are strengthening women's influence in the family and giving them a legal role in many decisions. So far, 18,000 families have received their land titles here, giving them an incentive to increase their own investments. Ladies and gentlemen, a body of research gathered over the last decade shows that rural women like Aisha are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change and far more likely to die as a result of natural disasters and conflict than men. This in turn deepens gender inequalities, creating a vicious circle. Women, however, are also the bedrock of rural communities. They tend to respond to challenges with innovativeness and resourcefulness to ensure the well-being of their families, and they can play a very vital role in managing climate risks. So clearly, effective and sustainable interventions that can address climate change and build resilience must seek gender transformative outcomes. They have to aim to transform power relations that are shaped otherwise by unequal gender norms and practices. And they have to aim to empower women so that they have a greater capacity to adapt. A couple of data points, ladies and gentlemen. 1.7 billion people in the world are women and girls living in rural areas. Worldwide, less than 15% of agricultural land is registered under a woman's name. And while 164 countries recognize their right to own, women's right to own, use, and make decisions about land on equal terms with men, discriminatory customary laws mean that only 52 countries guarantee these rights in practice. And last but not least, less than 2% of climate-related ODA, official development assistance, identified gender equality as a primary objective in 2018. So what does this mean for climate change action? As highlighted by the Global Commission on Adaptation, our approaches we are counseling and advising should build on a few principles: context awareness, equal access to and control over resources and assets, recognizing and addressing women's time poverty due to care and domestic work, investing in basic social services, infrastructure, and social protection, and opening up spaces for discussion, collaboration, participation, and decision-making. If we want to see this change happen quickly, we need to join forces. And a really good example of this collaborative work is work that we are doing together amongst the Rome-based agencies through the joint program on rural women's empowerment, economic empowerment. During its first phase, climate-smart agricultural techniques were applied across all countries, while local, safe, and diversified food production was encouraged, which in turn has contributed to the development of sustainable food systems at the local level. I'm really happy that the second phase, which will be launched imminently, will have an even stronger focus on strengthening rural women's resilience to climate change. As long as gender inequality continues, climate change and conflict will ravage rural communities. They will only become more resilient, ladies and gentlemen, to a lot of this unpredictability if women like Aisha are empowered to take decisions and access resources that they need to adapt and adopt. We, as Rome-based agencies and the international community at large, need to step up our efforts and commitment to tackling this. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Yopuri, for those remarks, for actually bringing to us the reality that rural women and girls are facing with the case example of Bangladesh, but also highlighting the agency that women and girls have to actually be part of the solutions to the climate crisis. And now we are excited to show a video that's made by the Goodwill Ambassadors of the Rome-based agencies for this year's International Women's Day. Over to you, technical team, for the video.
Look, a lot is going on in the world right now. If there is one thing I know for sure, Women and girls are so strong, but they face growing challenges.
Did you know that more than 800 million people don't have enough to eat? The pandemic has made the food crisis worse.
In the past couple of years, the world has witnessed an increase in temperatures and natural disasters due to the ever-growing threat of climate change.
The majority of people suffering from conflict, climate, and chronic hunger in this world are women and girls.
Women play a major role in how we grow, harvest, process, store, transport, buy and sell, prepare, and consume food. So as we transform our agri-food systems, it is crucial that we pay attention to their specific needs, build their resilience against major shocks like conflicts or weather change, and give them the tools to deal with the impact of climate and economic change.
Studies have consistently shown that natural disasters and climate change are impacting women and girls harder, because they tend to be poorer than their male counterparts and more dependent on threatened natural resources. As a result, women and girls face greater risks of becoming climate refugees.
But don't just take our word for it. Let's hear from some rural women themselves about what they want and what they need.
I demand equal decision making for land control, access and utilization.
بدنا دورات تدريبية وتوعوية ذكية حتى نحل مشكلة قلة المياه المنطقة.
I demand na mapabilis ang pag-access ng loan sa aming mga kababaihan.
Necesito mayor apoyo en asistencias técnicas para la formación de mujeres líderes y emprendedoras.
More capacity building, more trainees.
كسر حاجز عمل المرأة خارج المحافظة، فهي بحاجة إلى شبكة مواصلات.
I demand more women to get involved in conservation agriculture for food security.
اتخاذ القرار زي الرجل وبطالب بتسهيل
Demand nga matutukan sa gobyerno kami mga kababainhan ilabi na ang mga single mother.
أطالب بالمساواة بالأجور بين الرجل والمرأة.
Que nos apoyen con capacitaciones e insumos para beneficiar además familias de la comunidad y a las mujeres especialmente.
I demand dugang skills training namong mga kababainhan ug mapalambo.
بطالب بتوفير فرص عمل في القطاع الزراعي بتراعي في خصوصية النوع الاجتماعي للمرأة.
Preciso de uma sociedade com equidade de gênero, respeito às mulheres e desenvolvimento de políticas públicas para as mulheres rurais.
I demand equal ang pagtagad sa among mga kababainhan na magdumala sa mga proyekto ug sa pagpalambo sa kinaiyahan. Kay kung kaya sa mga kalalakian, kaya namong mga kababainhan.
So International Women's Day is a global day to celebrate the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women, while making a call to action for strengthening gender equality and accelerating women's empowerment worldwide.
Let's rise to the challenge and close the gender gap in agriculture.
Today I stand in solidarity with women and girls around the world, including Ukraine, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Yemen, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Somalia, and really wherever there is both hunger and conflict. And like Maya Angelou says,
we rise, we rise,
we rise.
Thank you so much for that video. And what is really clear is we know what needs to happen. I think those women in that video are very clear, very articulate about what we need to do. And I'm very excited to bring a panel to you to discuss this year's theme, to discuss some of the work that they're doing to make sure that we achieve gender equality and the empowerment of women, but that we respond to the calls of women. I looked at this panel and it's a very exciting panel. One, because they have a very intersectional way of looking at the diversity of women and ensuring inclusion of this diversity of women into the work on climate change, on disaster risk reduction. So first, we have Elham Youssoufian, who is the Inclusive Humanitarian Action and Disaster Risk Relief Reduction Advisor for the International Disability Alliance. Welcome, Yusufian. And I have a question for you to start us off with this conversation. How are women with disabilities at particular risk from the effects of the climate crisis? But even more importantly, how can we make sure that they participate in climate action and that they are part and parcel of the climate policies and programs that we are developing?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, happy International Women's Day. It's my pleasure to be part of this panel and enjoy this very important conversation. I represent the International Disability Alliance. My organization is an alliance which is composed of over 1,100 organizations of persons with disabilities. Organizations that are established by persons with disabilities themselves, being governed by persons with disabilities themselves, and advocating for equality and rights of persons with disabilities around the world. We know that the number of women with disabilities is even higher than men with disabilities, and women tend to have disability more than men. The reason is because women tend to live longer and also being subject to violence and abuse, which may develop impairments and the impairments associated with maternity. So it is estimated that at least 1 out of 5 women have a disability. This number is of course higher in older women. The sad reality, but at the same time motivating reality, is that we don't have a lot of evidence and data on the impact of climate change on women with disabilities. So I was listening to the previous speakers giving us numbers of how 80% of climate displaced people are women and children. And unfortunately, we don't know how many of these population are women and children with disabilities, but it's not difficult for us to assume. Let us look at the story of a woman with disability. Let's call her Nila, who lives in a small island in the Pacific.
Elham, just a quick one. Your sound is breaking. Do you have? Can you try with a different set of mix or directly onto your computer? We see whether that would be better.
Maybe I need to.
There's some friction in the sound.
Is it better now?
Yes, it's gone. Let's try that.
Hello.
Yes, let's try that now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Elham?
Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you very well.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So I just wanted to give a quick list of additional barriers that a woman with disability, her name is Nila, is facing to when the climate is hitting her community. First of all, let's look at it from a food and access to food and nutrition perspective. Of course, when climate hits, access to food and nutrition is reducing for the whole family. Unfortunately, the first group who was being left out because of the stigma and attitudes is this woman with disability. So let's assume that she is deaf. So the family members prefer to allocate the very limited food available to those members, family members who are actually part of the workforce or assumed part of the workforce. If the family, due to socio and economic situation, has to prioritize paying educational fees for the children in the family or the teenagers in the family, unfortunately, again, this deaf girl is more likely to be excluded because of the attitudes that exist, probably, that mention, okay, a woman with disability or a girl with disability cannot benefit much from education. That's why very, very limited. There are different statistics, but we hear that almost 5% of women with disabilities around the world can access education. So it's not difficult to imagine that in a location at the front of climate crisis, this number is much lower for girls with disabilities. When it comes to displacement, because usually they live in a more difficult areas, they cannot, they are the first who are hit by climate crisis. For example, in this case by sea race, but you can imagine on other crises. There are usually the displacement journey is not accessible for a girl with disability because family members, especially if the girl with disability or woman with disability is using wheelchair, usually the transportation is not accessible. If the disaster hits, accessing to evacuation is a big challenge. And even like the centers who provide provisional assistance to people who are subject to disasters caused by climate are usually inaccessible. I'm hearing about the interesting program that Rome-based agencies are organizing to ensure access to climate resilient agriculture and other programs for women and girls around the world. But the question is how much these programs are accessible for women and girls with disabilities. Sometimes there are legal and policy barriers for women with disabilities to access resources or participate in these programs. So for example, are the information to apply to be able to benefit from these programs provided in accessible format? So for example, if this deaf woman wants to participate in a program and apply to be part of it and enjoy these new techniques, is the information shared in accessible format so she can learn about it? If the paperwork is accessible for the blind woman who is the hold of the family, who can access it? Are the special situation or additional barriers for women with disabilities considered in these policies and programs? Is data collected based on disability? So any data, any research that we do to ensure that, okay, to kind of assess the impact or assess the participation of women with disabilities, is this disaggregated by disability and different types of impairment? Like, do we know how many deaf women can access, how many blind women can access, how many women with intellectual disabilities have been subject to different barriers? These are all questions, and I understand that I pose a lot of questions more than providing answers, but that's exactly the indicator of where we are standing right now in terms of inclusion of women with disabilities. But I want to wrap up with the good news. The good news is that there is a strong interest and motivation among women with disabilities to be part of the solution. Climate impacts us more than every other women and more than our brothers with disabilities. So we want to be part of the solution. But we face many barriers to participate. So we just heard about how women are underrepresented in climate negotiations and processes, which is not going to be addressed if you go with the same pace until 2068. So I leave it to you to imagine what's the number for women with disabilities or people with disabilities in general. If climate conversations that are being organized invite women with disabilities to be around the table, make sure that they have access to information in accessible formats, in sign language, in captioning, in plain language, in audio and braille or other formats that the blind user would be able to participate, women with disabilities can be around the table. If they are considered in planning and policy making. They are happy to be part of the solution, and no doubt we have a lot of solutions and ideas to share. So looking forward to more collaboration. I hope this is a wonderful start opportunity or enforcement opportunity, and maybe next year on the International Women's Day, we have a great amount of information to share about how we work together to ensure that women with disabilities can equally benefit from and participate in climate resilient building programs and policies.
Thank you so much, Elham, for those thought-provoking questions, actually, in terms of how we can be more inclusive of women with disabilities in both disaster risk reduction and managing the climate crisis, but also highlighting some of the gaps that you see, the fact that we have data gaps on how many of those women that are affected by the climate crisis, or that are living in rural areas, or that are hungry, actually have disabilities. And that's something that those are gaps in data that we know that we need to close. But also for some of the practical things that you mentioned that could actually be integrated in disaster risk reduction programs and climate programs to make sure that we are more inclusive of women and girls that are differently abled. Thank you so much. And now our second panelist is Carla Madueno, who's an ecologist and climate youth activist for the Youth in Landscape Initiative. Carla was recently speaking at COP26, and I'm really excited to hear some of her views on the issue. So Carla, thank you for joining us and welcome to the session. As a youth climate activist that participated in COP26, what do you think are some of the lessons that have been learned as we commemorate this International Women's Day in terms of actually making sure that we are treating women and youth with dignity in our programming? Over to you, Carla.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Well, I want to start commemorating the International Women's Day, sharing some reflections, and I will try my best to answer the question that I have just been asked on how can we implement or learn from the lessons out of COP26 in Glasgow and implement the learnings in a dignified way for women and youth. So it turns out that I had the unique opportunity to, in regards to my youth activism, work with the Youth in Landscapes Initiative and other platforms. I had the unique opportunity of being invited to November last year, the COP in Glasgow, and to observe from my youth lens, perhaps, and also perhaps Global South lens, because I am a Peruvian ecologist, observe the process, perhaps the shortcomings, and also celebrate the achievements. The COP had overall, we know, the clear achievement of maintaining the 1.5 degrees goal alive. However, as you probably heard, there was a lot of criticism that exposed the North and the South asymmetries in terms of equal participation, equal access, administrative restrictions that perhaps did not give batches on time to the manifold participants and representatives of very, very fundamental groups of civil society. So my experience was under the umbrella of the youth delegation for Yango. Yango is the UNFCCC youth constituency. So let's say it's the youth body that represents and takes youth to that negotiation space every year. And we were a delegation of 100 observers. And already the first restriction came up the moment we were wondering, hey, how can we enter the negotiation rooms where the diplomats are meeting, the parties are meeting, these clauses and these very important documents are being discussed. And the answer was, on a daily basis, as youth, we were only provided 4 badges to enter these rooms. So you could imagine that a delegation of 100 thirsty youth representatives from all across the globe having to, let's say, take turns in who gets the badges to access which room and to follow up with which type of item or topic. That was already kind of, let's say, a hard cut that not only myself, but also other observancies had to encounter. And as I walked along the pavilions and the exhibition areas, of course, I had the chance to link up with Latin American leaders and even indigenous representatives. And I had the unique exchange conversation with a female indigenous representative from the Ecuadorian forests. So she, speaking Spanish, she talked to me and she said that somehow the formalities in these spaces sometimes make it difficult for these new and much needed voices to penetrate and navigate this space in a confident and meaningful manner. Because the risk that we both saw is that when you're new to these spaces and when you're coming from a long trip from abroad, when you're perhaps bringing a lot of heavy testimonials of vulnerabilities of coming from frontline communities experiencing climate change at first hand. And then you encounter all of these language barriers, administrative barriers, the number of badges and so on. You could feel a bit intimidated, perhaps even not heard. Perhaps you could feel that your testimonial from the streets or from the jungle or from the mountains is not quite penetrating those decision-making spaces. So I took and I shared these informal dialogues with a broader audience today, because I think these little yet fundamental observations can shed light on what could be the possible solutions for making these negotiation spaces friendlier for women leaders, for representatives of underrepresented groups, such as indigenous groups and youth. And I thought that perhaps in order to increase women participation, parties delegations could create some sort of fixed quota for saving a spot for female negotiators in these spaces. Another option could be that perhaps we could think of gender and youth parity in these type of processes, where not only at high level we would save a spot for youth representatives, but also in local or national levels, we would ensure already that young leaders are having a stake at the decision-making table. Moreover, I also thought that the importance of talking about youth comes from the fact that they will be our future leaders, and they are already experiencing, let's say, the consequences or the benefits of the good or the wrong decisions taken by our current authorities. So I think there is a lot of untapped opportunities that we need to bring back, let's say, into the agenda, into how we address these spaces. I think the connection is fundamental in such a special day like today, and such a special honor for me to be in the panel with people that really devote their efforts and capacities to advancing the agenda for women. I really feel like now it's the perfect time to think of new leadership. And new leadership for me means that we invite more and more young female leaders to the negotiation tables. And we don't think of them as a backup plan. We don't think of them as you are the female leader that is supposed to clean up the mess that somebody else did before you came in, but rather we take them as our first choice. So it requires a bit of shifting perhaps the mindset, but I think it's fundamental for us to start thinking in that way. We also need new leadership on board to move away perhaps from silos. Systemic crises like biodiversity loss crisis and the climate crisis, among many other humanitarian crises at the moment, they require systemic thinking and systemic solutions. So new types of leadership, that disruptive thinking, will allow us to leave the silos and create connections and see from the perspective of the people that are already vulnerable and are already in the victim role, let's say, and we will facilitate leveraging their voices to broader audiences. Another reflection that I take away from COP, but also from other processes that I have accompanied in the last years in my work as young representative or just young activist in these sustainability matters, is that women need to start believing in themselves and really internalizing that they are able to do things, that they do not need to feel shy, that they do not need to fall in the imposter syndrome of believing that they cannot do things. Women can do things, and women are doing great things already. And it's very important for us to make space for women, but also I invite women, especially young female leaders in this audience, to take space at the decision-making tables. And here, just to finish my intervention, I can share a small anecdote that I had as I was doing my master research in the deepest Andean province in Peru called Apurímac. I had the contact with a Quechua-speaking woman who was also able to speak in Spanish to me. And she said that this entire program, because I was in the area because of a Andean forest restoration program, and she said this entire program actually benefited from the fact that people in the place, years before the NGO put attention into this area, that people in the place were talking about the importance of protecting forests, and that she was one of them, that despite being woman and not being invited to the regular local meetings, and perhaps even not being accepted to stay there and to promote the idea of protecting forests, she nevertheless persisted, because she really thought that if they are not taking care of their own forests, which is the ecosystem that provides them with all of that sustains their livelihoods, then who else should take care for it? So her testimonial for me really made the point that we don't need to be only making a space and taking a space at high level spaces, but it all starts in your community. It all starts in your local municipality, in your local group. As we saw in the videos at the opening, the change starts also in, and most importantly, also in the rural sector. And that's kind of the testimonial that I wanted to share from a very humble yet very leading personality that I had the opportunity to meet in Peru. And my final question to before I give it over to the moderator is, in the current circumstances of insecurity and of conflict in Europe, and not only in Europe, but also human-made conflict to nature, I want all of us to rethink of what leadership means for us today. Who are our true leaders? If they are representing our needs, or if they are not representing our needs, then can we, female women, can we become ourselves the bold, integral, and selfless leaders that the world needs? And I invite at last young woman to become the best version of yourself, with creativity, with boldness. And I invite you to construct new times with justice for the benefit of our own communities, of our own planet, and of our own society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carla. You are an inspiring young woman, and thank you for those actually really thought-provoking interventions there. You know, that it's not just, first, that we know women have been leaders in their communities, whether they're indigenous women, they've taken care of the land, of our forest, of our biodiversity. And we need that leadership to percolate into the decision-making levels where international decisions are being made, because they do then affect women on the ground. And it's not just enough for women to take up these leadership positions, but these spaces also have to be inclusive of women and the young people, and especially not to look at young people as leaders of tomorrow, because you are leading today. You know, we need that leadership. The world needs that leadership today, because tomorrow is too late. So we need young people's leadership today. And even as they become bold, as they take up the challenge that you're giving them, we need the spaces to be inclusive. We need the spaces to be ready for those voices, so that all this wisdom, this energy, this creativity of young people actually plays a role in the way we are managing our resources today. So thank you so much, Carla, for those very, very, very thoughtful interventions. Now to our last panelist, and before I introduce our last panelist, to remind you that you can put in your questions for Carla, for Elma, and for our last panelist in the Q&A, and we will have some time to respond to some of those questions. So our final panelist is Andrea Grosvenor, who's the Deputy Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. And Andrea, I have one quick question for you. Why is women's role and participation so crucial for disaster risk management, and how are you at the agency ensuring that their leadership is integrated into your work?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and it's certainly a pleasure to be a part of this esteemed panel today. The women's role and participation is absolutely crucial for disaster management. As you are aware, gender equality and human rights were often not acknowledged as critical to successful disaster risk management within the Caribbean region. Despite an international framework on women's empowerment within the context of gender equality, many attempts to incorporate women's role and participation in efforts in disaster management have initially been confined to ad hoc and short-term technical interventions. And so far, they have mostly failed to dismantle unequal power structures or to have an impact on closing the gender gaps. And so as a result, gender inequalities continue to hinder sustainable development. And these inequalities are manifested in different areas, sectors, and among certain groups, particularly women and girls, with disaster management initiatives being no exception. And additionally, women and girls are also subject to indirect impacts that arise in the aftermath of disasters, such as sexual and gender-based violence, loss of livelihood, access to education, deterioration in sexual and reproductive health, and increases in their workload, all of which compound the gender-specific impacts of disasters. So consideration of these gender-specific needs, skills, vulnerabilities, and capabilities is essential for inclusive and gender-responsive disaster management. We also know that numerous studies and experiences worldwide have confirmed that gender inequalities must be addressed as part of biodiversity conservation, land restoration, adaptation and mitigation to climate change, and efforts to transition to an inclusive and regenerative green economy, especially after the pandemic. We are also increasingly recognizing that when women's voices, knowledge, and experiences are not taken into account, we have essentially sidelined half of the opportunities for half of the population. So this must change if we are to achieve sustainable development for all. So notably in the Caribbean region, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, as an institution of the Caribbean community, champions the Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy 2014 to 2024, whose goal is sustainable development and is aligned and embodies the region's commitment to promoting progress towards the sustainable development goals, including Goal 5, gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. As we celebrate this International Women's Day, it is said that a woman's hand can rock the cradle and rule the world. So as we ponder more closely this question about why is women's role and participation crucial for disaster management, I'm sure that you'll agree with me that there are many answers to this question. But today I just want to focus on 5 reasons. We can count it on just one hand. So why is this role important? Women play an active role in society, in development, and in disaster management. Whether it is volunteering, homeschooling, cooking and cleaning, or giving elderly caregiving, women play these active roles. And multiple studies show that genders experience disasters differently, with women and vulnerable populations being more susceptible to their devastating impacts on account of a multitude of pre-existing inequalities and gender gaps in access to health, social protection, education, productive resources, economic opportunities, and voice and agency. However, we also know that women are twice as likely as men to experience increases in unpaid duties post-disaster, according to an IDB 2020 study, but they still perform those critical roles. Secondly, women face shocks differently than men. Women's employment is generally less diversified than men's, reducing their resilience to shocks, according to a UN Women's study in 2020. And in the Caribbean, women make up of the majority of the main economic earner, which is the tourism sector. We consider the Caribbean a paradise. And so tourism, as that key economic earner, was adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Destinations experienced a 67% fall in international tourist arrivals in 2020 compared to the previous year. And the Caribbean Hotel Tourism Association showed that 71% of hotels laid off their staff as a means of addressing the revenue shortfall. And so therefore, it meant that many women who were the main workers in this sector were displaced. Thirdly, women's voice and experiences must be heard. The Caribbean does experience multi-hazards, and recent events have demonstrated the systemic nature of risks that undermine development. And lessons from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which has a large agriculture base and experienced an explosive eruption in 2021, followed by a rainfall event and a dengue outbreak, all against the background of a pandemic outbreak, underscore that women's voices must be heard. Amongst the challenges faced was sheltering approximately 21% of the country's population, which was evacuated. That accounted to over 23,000 persons being displaced. Efforts made were commendable. Nonetheless, with limited resources in shelters, the persons were grouped by non-family members. There was poor lighting in some areas, and there was a lack of separation for bathroom facilities in some areas as well. And this placed women and girls at risk for gender-based violence. Women's employment was also significantly impacted by the eruption, as it created instability in the sectors which were already fragile as a result of COVID-19, where women were predominantly represented. Fourthly, women are change agents in disaster management. They constitute half of the population, and their voices, knowledge, and experiences, which are significant, must be taken into account. The perception of women and girls as passive, vulnerable groups means that their roles in positively contributing to disaster risk reduction, post-disaster response and recovery, and preparedness strategies, this role is often overlooked. This perception perpetuates the inequality, and it does reduce opportunity for women and girls to participate in that planning and decision-making process. Nevertheless, we do want to herald the work that has been done by Caribbean women, as they have often arisen as change makers in disaster risk reduction. And today, we join with the Pacific Disaster Center, who celebrates International Women's Day, honoring the stellar women who are making exceptional contribution to their communities and professions, but also highlighting the women of the Western Hemispheres who are change makers in disaster risk reduction, including our own first female executive director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, Miss Elizabeth Riley, but also the first female executive directors and leaders of the Supradinat and FEMA. Finally, I want to say that we are women and we are resilient. Resilience is a central theme of the Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy in the Caribbean, and coupled with the resilience framework approved by the head of government of the Caribbean community, the COVID-19 pandemic has really underscored this resilience story. Women have multitasked as they have homeschooled, prepared meals, fed families, Zoomed, and all these things, even as they would have certainly worked from home in that environment. So women have also been heralded as shining examples of vital and effective leadership in the pandemic response. Countries where women are the head of state, like Finland, Iceland, New Zealand, have been internationally recognized for the effectiveness of their response to the pandemic. And in the Caribbean, PAHO has also highlighted the Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honorable Mir Amor Motley, for her work and leadership in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and has produced a publication highlighting Barbados as an example of government leadership and regional cooperation in containing the COVID-19 virus. So at SEDEMA, and with our partners in the Caribbean, therefore, we will continue to invest in actions that promote gender equality in CDM, provide psychosocial support in the multi-hazard disaster context that address the needs of women, continue to work for 20 participating states to gather the disaggregated data from baseline statistics to include sex, age, and disability differentiation as we advance disaster risk management, and contribute to strengthening the shock responsive social protection environment to assist our participating states in adapting policies to be shock responsive. And through the Enabling Gender Responsive Disaster Recovery, Climate, and Environmental Resilience in the Caribbean project, advance our recovery efforts in the region as part of the Caribbean Resilient Recovery Facility, which was recently launched in the Caribbean. As we advance CDM and the resilience framework, we want to facilitate the integration of gender considerations into the development of our policies and programs that promote the development of more resilient societies. So therefore, I want to thank you for this opportunity to highlight CDEMA's contribution to gender responsive actions and initiatives in disaster management. We appreciate this effort to commemorate International Women's Day in this forum and to share our part in ensuring that women's voices are included and heard in our interventions to make the Caribbean region more gender equal, safer, and resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adria, and especially for highlighting those 5 key issues that you think are important, including recognizing the roles that women and girls play, but also the importance of their leadership in disaster risk reduction. I would like to, is everybody on screen? Yes, fantastic. So there's a couple of questions coming in for you, and I'm going to start with Elham. Elham, you highlighted a few things on how to better integrate the needs, priorities, perspectives of women and girls that are differently abled into programs. The question for you is, can you please share some more insights on how to make our agricultural and rural development programs more inclusive and accessible for people with invisible disabilities?
Thank you so much for this very thoughtful question. This means, I can understand that the person who asked this question has already thought a lot about engaging people with disabilities in the program, so I really appreciate it. If I want to share a few very quick insights, that would be number 1, identify organizations of persons with disabilities in your area of work. So speaking of people with invisible disabilities, it means that, for example, people with mental health condition or psychosocial disabilities, people with autism, deaf people, so it's not visible if you talk about visibility, but in general, identify organizations that these people have built together, reach out to them in advance, not after launching your program. In advance, it's much more efficient if you do it in advance. So reach out to them, Tell them that this is a program you want to launch and see how you can collaborate with them. Number two, make sure that the information about the process to activate this and access these programs is provided in plain language and accessible formats. So for example, do not use the jargons, and make sure that they are you're using the plain and easy to understand, easy to read language as much as possible for the process. Another recommendation is that if you are, for example, a family member, a whole family, a whole household is applying and implementing the program, one idea that you can use is that if you specifically include in your questionnaires that is there a member with disability in your household, and you can use the interesting types of questions that we have, for example, on the short version of the Washington group questions. Washington group questions are questions to collect data on persons with disabilities. So there is a shorter version of it that you can identify disabilities. So you can include that in your questionnaires, your data collection. So you identify if there are family members with disabilities in the households that you're targeting. And if yes, then you can, for example, define a role for them in your program. So for example, you can mention, that's nice. So it's because we are adopting a holistic approach and a participatory approach in this program. We would like to see how your, for example, daughter with intellectual disability or autism is going to participate in this program, and encourage them to define a role for that family member. And finally, if possible, allocate some quotas in your programs for people with disabilities. Because what I hear from women with disabilities on the ground is that because of the eligibility criteria and the fact that they are usually in the lower socioeconomic status, it's very difficult for them to access these kind of programs and meet the eligibility criteria. Like, for example, the paperwork required for getting the loan or any other measures that you're putting in place. So consider some quota and specific allocation for women with disabilities, especially those women who are who have an invisible disability, who face additional challenges. Again, thank you so much for this interesting question, and I hope I wish you success in what you're planning to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Elham, and I totally love that response because it gives some really practical things for people to do, but also recognizing that this cannot be done after the fact. It can't be done after the program has been designed and neatly packaged, that it needs to be a participatory design process so that those needs and issues are incorporated before the design of the programs. Thank you very much for that. I have a question for you, Andrea. And the question is, if women have disproportionately lost jobs during the pandemic, has there been a movement of women into other industry sectors where they were previously underrepresented? So basically, has this been an opportunity to actually open up other sectors for women? And if so, do you think this diversification of employment will remain, or are we going to see a reversal back to the tourism sector as it recovers?
Thank you so much for the question. So I can answer anecdotally in terms of some of the things that we've seen. So for instance, what we've seen is that the emphasis on food, one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is that we need to feed ourselves. And in the Caribbean, we import quite a bit of our food. And what we've seen is, for instance, there's been a lot more emphasis on agriculture, women planting and also contributing in the production of food, primarily out for some base of self-sustaining to feed families, but also utilizing some of that food that can be sold as well to the population. But not only the planting of food, but also the making of different dishes and selling. You know, people have had the opportunity whether it's their little barbecue grill or also, just some type of establishment to also be able to sell food using their skills in that way. And interestingly enough, both in agriculture and the sale of food, these are also potential downstream industries for the tourism sector, because tourists want to also come and enjoy the culinary delights of a particular country, but also we have the opportunity to, if there's excess in agriculture, to be able to sell into tourism. The other thing I can say that we are seeing is that with the construction industry also taking off, that this has offered the opportunity, and we do see it emerging, where women are also being a part of that construction labor force. And because one of the things that you must recognize that in the tourism sector is not only that women are the majority of persons in the sector, but also they are also on the lower paying end of the sector. So therefore they are also transitioning then into these other tasks that will be associated with this level of work. But there's also what we are seeing is the opportunity for upskilling, taking the opportunity as well to increase educational opportunities and using this space to increase those skills. So I can say that the tourism sector will be enriched either by downstream services that can be provided, or even if women may choose to revert in some way in terms of contributing to the sector, you can also see that opportunities have arisen and have expanded therefore for women. And therefore we're happy about this, but we recognize that there are still also some women who have not been able to capture on these opportunities and are still experiencing some of the hardship from the pandemic fallout. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and really hoping that some of these positive trends continue even after the pandemic. I have a question too for you, Carla. What can we do to assure youth perspective is considered in the design of our climate programs? What are some of the practical suggestions that you have?
Thank you, Yemima, for the question. Well, key elements to make youth part of climate programs, actually, and perhaps quoting myself in my first intervention, is the fact that people sitting at the decision-making table, or at least at more senior spaces, that they make space for youth. And at this stage, I really need to perhaps share with just how things went in my case, and how COP for me was made possible. And this was made possible by two people that had the opportunity of deciding, do we want to have youth on board or not? And they really saw value in the contribution. They really took the courage and made the bold invitation to myself, reaching out, and those were Rachel Allen and Taylor Tondelli, to whom I'm greatly thankful for the opportunity given, which later on opened opportunities also for being today, accompanying you and sharing these experiences. And again, thank you, Ruben Cesar, for the kind invitation, and the entire FAO gender team for making it possible. This experience of my own already shows how people sitting or being able to perform at these spaces can make space for youth, for young female leaders or young female representatives from manifold backgrounds. Another concrete point for how climate programs can be advanced and can connect with youth is by literally just reaching out to manifold youth-led initiatives. We are always happy. I have had the opportunity in Peru to add comments and feedback on the National Adaptation Plan together with Jóvenes. I will not say it in Spanish. I will try to say it in English. It's the group of Peruvian youth fighting climate change, and with them we'll we literally submitted comments on how we thought this national adaptation program could be best designed under the lens of the youth. And I think these opportunities are key for opening up spaces for youth, as much as once we submit comments or once you institutions or funders or governments get those comments, to really take some time to go through them. Because as I said at the beginning, we are really at the edge. We are really part of those frontline communities, and our vulnerabilities need to be heard. Finally, all of this passion is not only passion for free, let's say. It takes definitely a mental health toll, an eco anxiety word. There is definitely a footprint that the entire crisis are leaving on us, present and future generations. And this, it's important to recognize that this entire human capital, this entire social capital has a value. And here I also advocate for the creation of green jobs and training opportunities for youth while designing climate programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla, for that. It would be difficult to summarize this very, very rich conversation, but I think a couple of the key messages coming through is that women and youth are part of the solution. We need to do better in terms of looking at women and girls in their diversity, whether they are differently abled, whether they are young or older, Indigenous women, that we need to really take this into account, that we know they are agents of change. They're driving a lot of local action. We've seen them drive national and international action, but that we need to be much more deliberate in terms of ensuring that they're leading today, and especially for young women, that they are leaders of today and not tomorrow, because what we do today has a bearing on what happens tomorrow. So it's my honor now to invite Maria Helena Semedo, the Deputy Director General of FAO, to offer some closing remarks and also some thank you to our panelists for today. Over to you, Ms. Semedo.
Thank you, Gemina. Excellencies, dear participants, dear sisters, dear Jo and Valerie. Happy International Women's Day to all of you here. And I am very pleased to give closing remarks to this celebration of International Women's Day 2022. Let me start with a special thought for women in Ukraine who are now having to cope with a devastating situation. Dear sisters, our vibrant discussion highlights women's central role for a sustainable tomorrow. We have heard diverse voice of women, youth, persons with disability, and Indigenous peoples from different regions. Please join me in commending today's speakers, Carla, Andrea, and Elham, that they give us much food for thought, not just on the key issues, but on the possible solution. Despite the daunting challenge we face, from the climate crisis and biodiversity loss, to conflicts and recovery from COVID-19, to increasing food insecurity and social inequality, we do have solutions to empower women, and you shared some of them with us today. But to have any meaningful and long-lasting impact to address today's issues, women and girls cannot be left out. And I think it was clearly said today. They must be at the center of solution and at the table designing those solutions. We also heard that climate crisis brings inequality. And as highlighted in last month's report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, women and girls are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. But why? Discriminatory gender norms mean that women and girls often lack essential coping capacities and survival skills to escape extreme weather events and natural disasters. And Elham told us that we need to integrate women with disabilities into the solutions. Adverse German norms constrain women's land tenure security in many regions of the world, limiting access to financial and advisory services, and adopt improved agriculture technologies and innovation that can help adapt to climate change. But we have solution, and I think Aisha was an example. Discriminatory norms prevent women from meaningfully participating in climate change negotiations. And Valerie referred to UNFCCC Secretariat report. And the same report tells us that in COP26, men took up 74% of the total speaking time, meaning that 3 out of 4 words coming from men's mouth. Dear sisters, we believe that first, to empower women in agri-food system and ensure equal benefits from climate action, we must ensure gender balanced participation at climate negotiation table, climate processes, and high-level forum. It has been also said by our speakers that we need to ensure that young leaders, women with disability, are part of the negotiation space, and that we need a new leadership in order to move to a systemic solution to the complex crisis we are facing. That silos approach is no longer a solution. This means scaling up innovative approaches and successful programs, and to ask our countries to include in their delegation women lead negotiation and also being inclusive in the UNFCCC processes. Can you imagine that in the last 25 years, only 3 women have ever been chairs of UNFCCC sessions? My sisters, words on paper cannot engage women. We need inclusive governance that prioritize equity and justice, involve everyone, including the direct participation of women and girls, to build climate resilient development that reconciles different interests and views. FAO supports countries to develop gender responsive climate policies and action in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and livestock. We have strengthened women's leadership and negotiation skills so they can be strong climate change negotiators. We also promote parliamentary action for target gender budgeting and investment in agri-food systems in the context of climate change and COVID-19 response. Second, we need gender transformative approaches are crucial to overcome existing barriers and social structures. These approaches can support access to climate smart technologies, services, and programs, and help eradicate gender-based discrimination in already climate-strained agri-food system. For instance, all my colleagues, Valerie and Joe, they refer to the joint program on gender transformative approaches for food security and nutrition. And this program supports gender transformative intervention, examine, challenge, and transform the deep-rooted gender norms, roles, and harmful practices that hold women and girls back from reaching their full potential. Third, we need to systematically apply gender-responsive planning and budgeting in climate finance. And I believe it was referred to the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and other finance regarding climate. And we need to track actual expenditures against gender equality commitments, and ensure that women direct benefit in their coping capacities, well-being, and wallets. This involves enhancing women's skills and resources for climate-smart practices and providing access to productive resources, markets, infrastructure, service technologies, and innovation. As Ambassador Goldberg said, investing in climate-smart, led by women, means growth will be for everyone. In closing, I wish to thank today's speakers for their enlightening contribution and our more than 500 participants for their active involvement. Thanks to our host today, WFP, our sister agency IFAD, for making this another successful International Women's Day celebration. I look forward to seeing you all next year when FAO has the honor to host International Women's Day. It is urgent that we all join forces to empower women as climate action leaders. Thank you again. Enjoy our International Day, and over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Maria Helena Semedo. And I think the only thing I'll add is thank you all very much. Thank you to our panelists for making this a very exciting, but also very practical conversation about some of the things that we need to do moving forward. I've been happy to join you as Rome-based agencies for this celebration.